We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which the podcast was made, the Yagara and Turrbal peoples. We recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the land's first storytellers and their deep connection to the lands, waters and seas. We pay our respects to elders, past and present.
Wanyari Gamingaming Gaurulko Ya Yagarajarana.
I think we've come a fair way, right? We've got doctors and lawyers coming out of universities. We're in a place where we can actually start to be much more active and proactive in pursuing our rights. Self-determination is something that we're a little bit clearer about in terms of what does that look like for our people in the face of the voice referendum and the decision that came out of that, put a perspective out in the public space that we don't have rights. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are challenging that, and we're standing up and saying, we do, they are inherent, you have an obligation to them, and we're going to take control over that and start pursuing them in our interests.
Old and new dreaming, from health and housing to land and language. What's next, and how do we get there together?
We are the main drivers, and it's for us to have the courage and determination to seek change and, again, for a better future for our children, as previous generations have successfully done for us. But I think also if you look at history again, none of those great steps forward have been achieved without solidarity from the broader Australian public.
For First Nations peoples, answers are shaped by culture and truth, and the priorities identified by multiple generations like justice, healing and self-determination. It's what our kids need and our elders deserve.
Look, people are feeling very bruised by events of recent times, but hopeful that if we come together and think deeply about what we want for our future, we can find a way to make our future a bright one.
This is the Rights Made Real podcast from the Queensland Human Rights Commission. And I'm Salua Middleton, a proud Torres Strait Islander woman with strong family connections to Erub. In this Gathering Strength series, you'll hear how we draw strength from the past to determine our own future. Episode 4, Dreaming, with Thomas Mayo, Professor Marcia Langton, and other community members who are helping shape the next chapter in First Nations history.
My name is Thomas Mayo. I live on Larrakia country in Darwin. I'm an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander man. My mob are Kororeg, Kukugal, Erabumle, and yeah, that's me.
How do you define human rights from a First Nations perspective?
Well, it really is about a justice that has not been delivered for our people, a justice that only we can achieve through standing up and standing strong and fighting for that, and that's what we've done since colonisation, and we're not going away.
How does the Uluru Statement from the Heart connect to that vision?
Well, the Uluru Statement from the Heart is one of a number of statements and petitions that we've made throughout the history of that fight for justice and recognition. It was made in 2017. I was one of around close to 300 of our mob from all around the country that were elected through processes in each region that covered, the entirety of the continent and adjacent islands. And it is a very powerful statement. It remains a live political document, even though the referendum for the voice component didn't succeed in 2023. And I encourage mob and I encourage every Australian to read it because it's a statement of fact. It is also very compelling as far as the existing situation and why we should be motivated to change, and a clear vision for that change and how we achieve it.
What lessons do you think can be learned from the referendum?
Well, I think what we learnt is that Australia was not ready to recognise us, that they were susceptible to the disinformation that we saw through the No campaign, from the No campaign. Australians knew enough of the truth to want to vote for it because the polling was over 60% for several years before the point of referendum in support. That flipped, though, when Peter Dutton and David Littleproud, the Nationals and the Liberals, the coalition, decided to, walk away from the national interest, walk away from bipartisanship on constitutional recognition, and selfishly try to make some political gain for themselves. You can see from the analysis the consistency of this majority support in Australia flipping in late 2022 when the Nationals went against it, before the question and the wording had even been determined by, a group of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders and, the government. I was one of those, the referendum working group. So it started to flip in late 2022, and then when Peter Dutton wouldn't even allow his members of parliament to have a conscience vote on whether they supported the referendum or not, it did the complete flip to 60% against. Now, what that tells us is that Australians knew enough to want this change, that reform to our constitution to recognise us in a meaningful way, but they were vulnerable because they were not familiar enough with our culture and our history and our heritage, and so they were vulnerable to the fear-mongering that then ensued from the coalition and their No campaign. And when people were made to fear that they would lose something personally, they were told that they're going to lose their backyards or their farms or their opportunities for their children to get a scholarship and go to a nice school, or that they'd have to pay a fee to go to the beach and all of this sort of rubbish. It was, they flooded the zone with shit, as the Trump campaign strategy goes. When that happened, that's when Australians decided to vote no. So I think the lesson from that is that we need to continue to educate the broader Australian public. We need to do more truth-telling. We need to continue that work. It's important work. But it also tells us that we're close. The result was 40% against. That's almost half of Australia. I don't think we would have got that result 10 years ago. And also, heartily, a great majority of young Australian voters voted yes, 18 to 24-year-olds. So the work that we're doing in schools, a lot of mob do work to help, the younger generations learn about us. That is also very effective and should continue.
What do you see as the most concerning human rights for First Nations people today?
Look, what keeps me awake at night is what's happening to our youth, the incarceration rates. In the Northern Territory, for example, almost all of the time, 100% of the youth in detention are Indigenous, and that's only growing. We have a country Liberal Party, so a conservative, right-wing party was elected in the Northern Territory. I think it was last year, and we've seen the numbers of our people in remand quadruple. So that's people that are languishing in detention, basically, without having had their case heard yet.
Are there any priorities where you're seeing progress?
Look, I think there's been some progress, and I think this is an important question, actually, to remind ourselves that even with the loss of the referendum, we're winning. We have seen, as I mentioned, 10 years ago, we wouldn't have seen that result. 10 years ago, there wasn't as much education in schools. People were generally not doing acknowledgements of country. or welcome to country, those simple acts of recognition. There wasn't murals all over cities, and also if you think about all the things that we have achieved, where unlike our elders that are, some that are still alive of that generation that didn't have a right to vote, that were not paid, there wasn't equal pay. There was still rations, or land rights and native title, in the last 30 years. We have made progress, and I think the bad actors, the people that led the No campaign, for example, would want us to believe that, we're losing, that we should give up. And if you look at history, we are making progress. The numbers of our people that are now lawyers and doctors and judges and silks. We've got Tony McAvoy here, the first Indigenous silk. He's not the only one anymore. In some ways, it has become harder since the referendum, but at the same time, we should understand that we are making progress.
I think you realise how much progress we've made. You also realise how significant a body of work that all of our old people have done, all of our elders and emerging elders as well. Like, things have not been easy for us, and for me it's really important to know where we've come from.
Well, when we talk about truth-telling, we go out and live in our communities. Live in my community. Truth-telling about me was, I was educated by Europeans. I was told when to eat, how to sleep, when to sleep and how to dress. I come from a long line of backgrounds, 13 children I come from. I come from that generational of the fact that I was in a dormitory. I wasn't served very good meals. I was always being ill-treated as a child. And I talk about intergenerational trauma. I mean, I live with it 24/7. I'm 59 years of age. I'll be 60 next year. And I live with it from the day I was born, down the river of the Nicholson River in Dumaji, to now. So that's how long I've lived with it. But you know what? It's about how we've revolved. Regardless of what government done, and regardless of what's in place now, we revolved. So what we're doing here today, we are revolving. We are revolving for the sake of our young people.
My advice to the next generation is get up and have a go and make the best of it. Don't be frightened to make a mistake.
So, Thomas Mayo, what role do you see for non-Indigenous Australians supporting the journey for justice?
Well, they're vital. I think all of our movements are, we are the main drivers, and it's for us to have the courage and determination to seek change and, again, for a better future for our children, as previous generations have successfully done for us. But I think also if you look at history again, none of those great steps forward have been achieved without solidarity from the broader Australian public. It has taken us to do it without them at first, but eventually, we have managed to bring enough people along with us to get those changes.
What sustains your hope and your commitment in this space?
That we start to see progress in closing the gap, that we see those statistics begin to become more humane to our people. That is, the ultimate goal. How we achieve those things is up to us to determine and to fight for. But we've got to take those steps forward in this generation as well, just like the others did.
We have a newly re-elected Prime Minister and a new Queensland Premier here. What's your message to Anthony Albanese or David Crisafulli?
Well, I'd say to Anthony Albanese, you've got the numbers now, mate. I think it's over 90 in the House of Representatives. Do something with that. Defy those in the coalition that jump up and down anytime something visionary in Indigenous affairs is proposed. Defy them and fight alongside us against those that try to take us backwards, and do something that is as visionary and as courageous as taking that question to the people in 2023. And that means truth-telling. That means supporting that from a federal level. That means treaty making, so supporting agreement making. It means delivering on the Uluru Statement in full, which is the Makarrata Commission. And to Chris Foley, I'd say, you are absolutely failing our people. You are doing the tough on crime thing that we know from history, from the things that governments have done. The tough on crime thing does not work. It is irresponsible when all of the statistics and all of the experts have said that locking up more children does not help those families or those children to get a better life, and it doesn't help the victims of crime. So you should change direction, and you should listen to Indigenous communities about how to do that.
And finally, what's your message for Mob?
For Mob, keep fighting. Don't give up. Be louder and prouder. They might have said no to our voice in 2023, but our voice needs to just get louder and louder until they cannot ignore us.
I work for an organisation, Culture is Life, and I co-facilitate our national leadership and development program. And it's really grounded in that sense of self and cultural values. So selected young people across the country will go through a 12-month program. And within that, we have different people that come and speak to us. We travel around the country, and it really helps you understand your place in the world.
It's up to us to define what the future looks like on our terms, and that's why I'm really convinced that a conversation around self-governance and self-determination is the way forward for our nations and our communities, and that, we don't deviate from that. We stop listening to others telling us what the priority needs to be, and we set that up for ourselves. And I think that's hopefully what some of the success of these conversations will lead us to.
Professor Marcia Langton calls on 65,000 years of history to plot a path forward. Anthropologist and revered academic, she reflects on her own childhood when considering the future of First Nations children.
My name is Marcia Langton. I was born and raised here in Queensland. I was born in the Royal Women's Hospital here in Brisbane, actually. My grandmother lived out west in Charleville later in her life, but, she worked on stations all around southeast Queensland. And she spoke a language that, was obviously one of those small languages that was overtaken by Bidgera as that became the big regional language. It sounds like a bit like Bidgera. It sounds a bit like Yuwalarai. She never said the name of her language. But she and her family, worked all through the southwest on stations. She ended up becoming a station cook for much of her life. And my grandfather was Iman from, the Upper Dawson Valley. And he was one of the people, along with his twin brother and his sister, who were force-marched up to Woorabinda in the 1920s. So they were married out on the Mitchell River and had a lot of kids. So I've got lots of cousins. But my focus has been on my academic career. I'm an anthropologist and geographer. I work at the University of Melbourne. But I do have a research project here in Brisbane. So I come back regularly to work on that and to see people.
How do you define human rights from a First Nations perspective?
Well, they're defined in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. It's a very important document. It took something like 25 years to develop it in the UN, so we shouldn't take it for granted. It's very difficult to have any of those rights implemented in Australia. The declaration is not a convention. It's a declaration, so it sets the standards of the rights that we should be entitled to. The Indigenous rights are a stream of human rights, and they derive from the body of human rights set out in the original human rights as defined by the United Nations and in the conventions, all of which are important. The Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, on the rights of women, and so on, the Convention on Biological Diversity. All of these conventions are important to Indigenous people as well. Now, even while Queensland is a human rights jurisdiction with the Human Rights Act, it's been very difficult to convince the governments of Queensland to not breach human rights. And I think the most egregious breach of human rights are the breaches of the rights of children, Indigenous children and Indigenous youth in the state practices of removing them from their families and their skyrocketing rates of detention in juvenile detention centres and the way that they are treated in those centres. So that, Indigenous rights are very important, but we may have to use all of the human rights architecture, all of the conventions and bodies of rights in order to protect young people and particularly children from abuses by the state. And of course, again, it's Indigenous children and Indigenous youth. They are the most at risk. And that is because of the political narrative that's peddled by political parties in order to win power. And it's now embedded in the public imagination that Aboriginal people are inherently criminal. And it's a terrible lie. It's a horrible narrative, but it's simply not true. So I think one of the things that we must do strategically is change the narrative and talk more about the great successes of Indigenous people in Queensland. And there are many to talk about. Indeed, the successes of Indigenous youth in universities who are winning awards for their groundbreaking work in science, in health and in many other disciplines. And I think, the progress that's being made with the completion of Year 12 studies by Indigenous children in schools, this is something to be very proud of. So I'm optimistic that they will change the narrative and also inject optimism into our strategies.
You've been involved in projects in Logan, Shepparton and Katherine, researching the impact of alcohol and violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. What has that research revealed, and do people see that in the context of human rights?
Well, it is plainly a human right that women and children have a right to feel safe. That is plainly a human right. And hence the research. How can women and children feel safer in the context of alcohol-fueled violence? Much of the violence is alcohol-fueled, not all of it is. Alcohol is not a necessary contributor to violence, but often it is. So that's what we're investigating. And we're investigating that in Logan at the request of our partner here, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Community Health Service. We are investigating it in Central Australia, where our partner is the Nganadara Pitjantjatjara Yankatjatjara Women's Council. And so we interview people in communities in the southern part of the Northern Territory and the northern part of South Australia at the moment, and also in the East Kimberley in Western Australia, where our partner is one of the Empowered Communities backbone organisations. And what we're discovering along the way is that there is a great concern about this problem in all of these communities, and people want to strengthen the programs that are working to prevent violence, and they also want to be supported to create more programs, especially, for instance, to support young people, to educate them into living a non-violent life, and to support men who are trying to overcome their anger and their tendency to violence, instead of using a range of other social skills that might be more useful to them.
You've also highlighted systemic issues in the criminal justice system, including the overrepresentation of Indigenous people. Are the reforms needed related to human rights?
Well, of course, the industrial scale incarceration of Aboriginal people, men, women and children, across all the Australian jurisdictions, clearly breaches a range of human rights. So it cannot be the case that all of these people who are incarcerated, for instance, in the Northern Territory on any given day, all of the children in juvenile detention are Aboriginal, all of them. So the overrepresentation in the population in incarceration as compared to their representation in the population tells us that the incarceration rates are not logical. It is not possible that all of these people are criminals.
The state and federal government are always moving the goalposts, and I say to our people, the goalposts will always move. Us as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we're going to build our own goalposts so that it doesn't move.
It has come from what I learned at the kitchen table, where we never believed ourselves less than. And therefore, we never accepted less. We never argued for less. And I want my kids to be entitled. I want them to have a sense of injustice. I want them to have rage at injustice. I do not want my children being resilient to racial violence. You know, we talk about a future as this sort of sunshine and rainbows kind of place, and a future I see is black fellas that are sustaining the fight, that are keeping the fire burning. That's beautiful to me.
Professor Marcia Langton is looking to emerging leaders as the next generation to pick up the torch and light the way towards just and effective communication with political leaders.
The youth are stepping up through leadership programs, through their youth summit here last week, and they have very clear ideas, and I'm full of hope that they will, go on with their careers and become great Australian leaders, great Indigenous leaders, and create that better future that we all want. So that makes me very hopeful. They're very competent, they're educated, they understand the importance of education. They're charming young people, they're polite, they're respectful, they're deeply thoughtful, and I give them full credit for being the young leaders that they are and the leaders of the future. Look, people are feeling very bruised by events of recent times, but hopeful that if we come together and think deeply about what we want for our future, we can find a way to make our future a bright one.
What do you see as the key priorities moving forward?
We need, as Tony McAvoy just pointed out, here in Queensland, the Queensland Human Rights Commission to facilitate meetings to enable the Indigenous people of Queensland, the traditional owners, the cultural knowledge holders, to join forces and form a representative body so that there is a strong democratic relationship with government that represents the concerns of our people. It is no longer acceptable to any Indigenous person that the scale of the disadvantages that we face, and which worsen with each generation, continue. And the only way to close those gaps is to work with the state government, particularly because it's the state governments that have most responsibility to implement sensible, rational policies that are effective and successful. And many of them at the moment aren't. They're knee-jerk responses to hysterical racism, hysteria about crime, but by incarcerating young people of any background, Indigenous or not, at the rate that is happening at present, is creating criminals in the future. This is not the way to deal with the problem. So there's that. There are many other problems, such as the delegation to Indigenous corporations to deal with children who are reported under child protection laws, so that the Indigenous community, the responsible people in the Indigenous community, are managing children who are at risk, and they're not being funneled into a vicious system where we lose them forever and they're highly damaged by the experience of the so-called child protection system.
And finally, do you have a message for mob?
We can all do better. And it's very important that we support our young people and give them hope for the future and talk about the successes in our community.
Dreaming, with thanks to Thomas Mayo and Professor Marcia Langton. Gathering Strength is a 4-part series where I yarn with First Nations community members about how to protect their human rights. It's part of the Rights Made Real podcast, supported by the Queensland Human Rights Commission. This episode also featured Mina Waller, Alf Lacey, Manny Williams, Michelle DeShong, Bruce Simpson, Professor Chelsea Watergo, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner Katie Kiss. A huge thank you to all the First Nations community members who spoke to us for this podcast and the film. There's also a Gathering Strength film, which extends this conversation. You can watch it on the Queensland Human Rights Commission YouTube channel. Rights Made Real is supported by the Queensland Human Rights Commission and produced by Dead Set Studios. Our executive producer is Kelly Reardon, supervising producer is Rebecca Livingston, and editor is Liam Reardon. Theme music was composed by Clay Cassadaly. And I'm Salua Middleton.